Hi folks, welcome to lesson 5 of unit 2 of the National 5 biology course. We're going to be looking at transport systems in plants in this topic. And so the best place to start when we're talking about plants is to talk about the organs, the main parts of a plant. So the plant organs that you need to know about for your exam are the roots, and we'll talk more in detail about what they are in a second, the stems and the leaves. Okay, and you can see each of those labelled on the diagram there. Okay, and we're going to go into more detail about each of those individual parts throughout this topic. So we're going to kick off with the leaf at the very top of the plant, first of all. Now, the leaf is quite a tricky little thing to learn, and they do often ask about it in the exam, so it's an important one for us to spend a wee bit of time here going over. So on the left hand side here you can see the different structures within the leaf and the function of those structures, and then on the right you can see the actual structure of the leaf and what it looks like, both in my own animation that I've my own diagram that I've made there, and in terms of a real life cross section of a leaf there that we can see, which it's been stained, but in reality, that's more like what the leaf would look like. So let's kick off first of all with the structure, because that's maybe a bit easier to get our head around than talking about the function too much. So we've got at the very top of the leaf here, we've got a layer called the upper epidermis. Okay, the upper epidermis. Now, the upper epidermis is where all of the light that's coming down from the sun, that is going to just be transmitted through that layer. Okay. Now, the upper epidermis has no chloroplasts in it. Okay, it has no chloroplasts, and it's also transparent, and it's really, really thin. And what that allows then is for lots and lots of this sunlight that is hitting the leaf to then go deeper within the leaf. Okay, so it will go beyond that first layer and into this second layer here. Now you might be asking, well, why not get as much as we can in the top layer? Because the cells that are just below it, the palisade mesophyll cells, they are very long cells and they contain many chloroplasts. And obviously, these cells with many more chloroplasts are going to be able to absorb much more of the light energy. Okay, so the upper epidermis is transparent to allow light to pass through. Then the palisade mesophyll, the second layer, has these long cells that allow light to be absorbed by the chloroplasts, by the many chloroplasts in these cells. Now, you might be wondering, where's that name come from, palisade? A long time ago, when they used to build like fortresses or something similar, they would put these big spiked logs and they would build a gate with that. They'd build a wall with those spiked logs, and they were really tall and thin. And the name palisade mesophyll comes from that, from those long, thin logs that used to surround like settlements and stuff. You know, it was used as a sort of first line of defense. So anyway, that's where the name comes from. So the palisade mesophyll. And I always think as well in my head, palisade. So I remember the palace part, and I always think palaces have long, thin towers, don't they? They've got lots of them. So that's how I remember palisade mesophyll in my head. These long, long cells. And what they do is they have lots and lots of chloroplasts to absorb more sunlight so that more photosynthesis can take place. And that's important to remember, is these are the cells where the majority of photosynthesis will take place. Okay? And then some of that light will manage to pass into these cells down here. Okay, so we do have some chloroplasts further down in this next layer, but just not as many. And this next layer here is called the spongy mesophyll. And you can probably see why by looking at the arrangement of this layer here. There are all these little air spaces here, okay? These little gaps between the cells, we call them air spaces. Okay, and what those air spaces allow is for gas to be exchanged. Okay, now you might think, well, why is that important? Because this is where photosynthesis is going to be taking place within the plant cell. So we need both oxygen to exit, but also carbon dioxide to enter the cells. So it's important that we have these air spaces to allow that gas exchange, that diffusion of substances between all of the cells. So that's the spongy mesophyll. And the way to remember that is a sponge is full of holes. Okay, it's full of these air spaces, and so is the spongy mesophyll. And at the very bottom of the leaf, on the lower layer there, we have what's called the lower epidermis. Okay, upper epidermis at the top, lower epidermis at the bottom. Now, the lower epidermis has got these special cells here. They're called guard cells. Now, what the guard cells do is they open and close. Okay, those cells are able to open and close. Okay, they basically fill up with water, and the filling up with water makes them turgid, and they basically close over that gap. And that gap between those two cells is called the stomata. Okay, so the gap on the underside of the leaf is called the stomata, and the cells either side of the gap are called the guard cells, and those open or close. Okay, and they obviously control the opening and closing of the stomata via doing that. Now, you might be asking, well, why is it important to have a little pore, a little hole on the bottom of the leaf? Well, that's to both allow gases to go in and out, but also to allow out the evaporation of water, any excess water in the leaf. And we'll talk about that in a few moments when we look at a different process. Okay, so you need to know those structures and where they're located within the plant. And you can see down here as well, we've got the upper epidermis at the top, placid mesophyll below it, spongy mesophyll below it, lower epidermis at the bottom, with our guard cells and our stomata there. Okay, and that's what they look like in reality, even though that's a stain cell. It's what closer to what they look like in reality compared to the diagram here. It's very likely the SQE will give you a diagram version. We'll see a couple of those when we look at the past paper questions later. Okay, so you also need to know, as well as the structure, you also need to know the function. So the upper epidermis, we talked about this earlier on, it's a very transparent and thin layer of cell. It has no chloroplasts, and that allows light to pass through. The palisade mesophils, they contain lots of chloroplasts, and they're closely packed together. Why is this? So they can absorb every morsel of sunlight, and that is where most photosynthesis will take place in these cells. We've got the spongy mesophils. They are these little round cells that contain some chloroplasts. Okay, they have some, but not as many as the palisade. And they, more importantly, have air spaces between the cells. And this allows the air, the gas, to circulate and reach those palisade cells. As we said earlier on, photosynthesis is taking place. We need to get carbon dioxide into those cells. We've got the stomata at the bottom. Those are the tiny pores. And what they do is they allow the carbon dioxide and water vapor to diffuse in and out of the leaf. Okay. We've got a vein within the leaf. Now, although I haven't put a vein on that diagram there, we often find a vein, but we'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay. We're just going to ignore that for now because we're going to go on to learn about the xylem and the phloem that are found in the vein. And then lastly, we've got our guard cells. Those are the cells that have chloroplasts, and they are found in the lower epidermis, and they control the opening and closing of the stomata. Okay, they control the opening and closing of the stomata, and you need to remember that for your exam. So we said we're going to talk about the xylem and phloem, and we're going to do that right now. So the xylem is, we're moving on to the stem now, by the way, we're on to the stem of the plant. And the xylem is one of the vessels that are found in the stem of the plant that transports water and minerals. Okay, so when water and minerals enter the plant through the root hairs, they then get transported in these dead xylem vessels. Okay, they are transported through the plant in dead xylem vessels. You have to remember that. What gets transported? Water and minerals. Now, the xylem cells are lignified, okay, and we can see these rings of lignin in the diagram here that go through these dead xylem vessels. And what they're able to do is they're able to withstand pressure changes, okay, because the water will be coming through quite quickly and with a lot of pressure at certain points. And similarly, there'll be other times where it's not moving with as much pressure, depending on the circumstance, the external environment for the plant. Okay, so those xylem cells have these rings of lignin, and those help to lignify the xylem vessel so it can withstand any pressure changes. Okay, so key takeaways: xylem transports water and minerals, the cells are dead, and they are lignified. The phloem, on the other hand, that's the other vessel that we find within the stem, that transports sugar. Okay, now sugar can be transported both up and down the plant in these living phloem cells. Now, phloem cells are interesting because they have two parts to them. They have sieve plates, okay, and you can see the sieve plates here in this diagram. They look a little bit like a sieve. And they also have associated companion cells. That's all you really need to know at National 5 level. You don't necessarily need to know so much about the function of those two parts, just that the phloem cell has those. Okay, the associated companion cell, which is there, it gives it energy. But as I say, we don't need to know that in Nat 5, and the sieve plates as well. Okay, so we've got the xylem transports water, the phloem transports sugar. The xylem is dead, the phloem is living, and the phloem has sieve plates and companion cells, whereas the xylem has these rings of lignin that help to withstand pressure changes. Okay, so that's your two vessels that we found within the stem of the plant. And lastly, we need to know about something called transpiration. Okay, now transpiration is the process of water moving through a plant, and importantly, it's evaporation through the stomata at the end. Okay, so it's the process of water moving through the plant from the roots all the way up to the leaves, and it's what happens at the end when the water evaporates through the stomata. So initially, water is absorbed by the root hairs due to osmosis. Now, see these 4 steps here? I would suggest that you go away and you memorize those ones because, again, that is a common question to be asked, where you're asked about the stages, where you're asked to recall all of these stages for an extended response question, or where you're just asked to identify what is happening in XYZ diagram. So learning all 4 of these are going to help you. So water is absorbed by the root hairs, and we can see that right down at the bottom. We can see these little hairs sticking out on the roots. Now, these root hairs have a large surface area. We know that large surface area is good in biology because it gives it more area to absorb the water. So water is absorbed by the root hairs due to osmosis. It then travels up the xylem, which we've just learned about, towards the leaf, which we've also just learned about. It enters the area of the leaf called the spongy mesophyll. Okay, and remember that's the area that has the air spaces in it. Okay, and we can see that up here. And then it will diffuse into those air spaces. Okay, which means it will move from an area of higher water concentration to an area of lower water concentration. And then it will exit the leaf via the stomata by the process of evaporation. Okay, so you need to know those 4 steps. Water is absorbed by root hairs, travels up the xylem, enters the spongy mesophyll, and it exits via the stomata. But not only that, you also need to know the process that happens at each stage. So, for example, water is absorbed by root hairs by osmosis, that it enters the spongy mesophyll and diffuses into the air spaces, and that it exits via the stomata by evaporation. Okay, so it's important that you get your terms right here. So we've got evaporation, we've got osmosis, we've got diffusion, and the overall process from the roots all the way to the leaves is called transpiration. Okay, so lots for us to remember there. Now, what things affect transpiration? Well, there are 4 main factors we need to know about that affect the rate of transpiration: wind speed, humidity, temperature, and surface area. Okay, now just knowing them is useful, but what more importantly, you need to know the effect that each of them have on the rate of transpiration. So when we increase the wind speed, that will also cause an increase in the rate of transpiration. Okay, so they have a sort of linear relationship. As the wind speed increases, the transpiration rate increases. Humidity is the odd one out because when you decrease humidity, that's when you increase the rate of transpiration. Okay, so that's the opposite of the other ones. That is a decrease for that one. With the temperature, an increase in temperature causes an increase in the rate of transpiration. And lastly, surface area. If you increase the surface area, you'll increase the rate of transpiration. Okay, so you need to remember the 4 factors, but also what effect increasing or decreasing the 4 factors will have on the rate of transpiration. And the way I remember this in my head is I just remember increase for wind speed, temperature, and surface area, and decrease for humidity. Humidity is the odd one out. That's the one where if you decrease it, it actually causes an increase in the rate of transpiration. And the last wee thing we need to know about in this topic is about this instrument here called a potometer. A potometer is one of these instruments that is actually extremely tricky to get to work in class. But when you do get it to work, what will happen is we will see transpiration through the cutting that you take and put into the instrument. Now, because it's drawing up water through its stem and it's evaporating the water out through the stomata and the leaf, that water will move along this instrument here. And as it moves along the instrument, it will draw along this air bubble. And that air bubble, we can measure where it is at the start on this scale, and then we can measure where it is at the end on this scale. And by doing so, we can measure the rate of transpiration in this particular cut bit of plant. Now, that's a useful experiment in order to measure the rate of transpiration. And it is something that can be asked about in your exam. So you need to know the name of the instrument and basically how it works. Okay, you don't need to know every in and out of it, but you need to know basically how it works. Okay, so I hope that all makes sense, folks. We're going to move on to the second part of the topic, which is where we look at the past paper questions. Okay, folks, so second part of this lesson, we're going to have a look at some past paper questions and how they relate to what we've just learned about. So the diagram below shows some of the structures involved in the transport of plants, which slide in the table below correctly identifies structures J and K and the substances transported by them. Okay, let's have a look. Structure J there. Now, what can we see about it? Well, we can see it's got little rings of lignin there, okay? And I think if we remember back to our notes from a couple of minutes ago, that makes that the xylem, okay? This one here, we can see the sieve plates, can't we? We can also see the companion cells as well there at the side, and therefore that makes this the phloem. Now that we know it's the phloem and the xylem, we have to remember what they transport. Now, the xylem, it transports both water and minerals, and the phloem transports sugar. So let's have a look at the table here and see which ones. Structure J is the xylem. We know that there. Structure K is the phloem. So we know it's going to be A or B. We know that the xylem transports water and the phloem transports sugar. So therefore, the only correct answer is A. Hopefully that was fairly straightforward to work out. If not, you need to look at your xylem and phloem again. Question 9. Transpiration occurs from the leaves of a plant. Which environmental conditions would produce the greatest transpiration rate? Okay, so we want to increase transpiration. Now, we talked about 4 factors. If we can remember the 4 factors, they were temperature, surface area, humidity, and wind speed. So which of those 3 would cause an increase in transpiration rate? It would be wind speed, temperature, and surface area. Okay, so do any of these suggest an increase in temperature and an increase in wind speed? This one here is an increase in temperature, that's good, but that's still air, so that's going to be a decrease in wind speed. Cold, no good, neither still air. Warm, good, that's an increase in temperature. Windy, that's an increase in wind speed. And then cold, no good. And windy would be good, but that's only one of the 2 options. So our only correct answer here is going to be C, because an increase in temperature and an increase in wind speed cause an increase in transpiration. So it's going to be this one here, C. 10. Which of the following shows the passage of water through the tissues when it enters a plant? So it'll start off in the roots. Okay, so it's going to be one of these 2 here. It will then move up through the stem, and we find the xylem in the stem, before it then moves on to the leaf, where we find the spongy mesophyll, but not the xylem, okay? And it's not going to be these 2 because that's wrong and that's wrong. So therefore the answer has to be A, okay? And one thing to note as well as I'm going through these is watch the process and the system that I use as I'm working these out, because that's a good system for you guys to employ in the exam. Work out what's definitely right, what you already know, and then by process of elimination, you can probably knock out a few of the options. Okay, question 12. Transpiration is? Now, is transpiration the evaporation of water through the stomata? That sounds familiar, but let's look at the other answers. Is it the uptake of water by the root hair cells? I think that's part of it, but I don't think that's the whole thing. Is it the transport of water through the xylem? Well, again, I think that's part of it, but it's not necessarily the whole thing. And the transport of sugars through the phloem. Okay, so it's definitely not that. It's to do with water. Okay, so we can get rid of D. Now, this is a tricky one because you're maybe thinking, okay, which one is it? Well, the uptake of water by root hair cells on its own is not transpiration, because transpiration, remember, is the whole movement of water through the plant and then the evaporation of water through the stomata. So it's not going to be that one, even though that's part of it. Similarly here, that's only part of the process. Now, for it to be transpiration, we need the end bit, which is the evaporation of water through the stomata. So our answer there is going to be A. 13, an increase in which of the following factors would decrease the rate of transpiration. Now, we said that there's a nice relationship between all of our factors, and when we increase those, it causes an increase in the rate of transpiration, apart from one. Now, if you can remember, which one did I say was the odd one out, where when you increase it, it actually decreases transpiration? Hopefully you remembered that was humidity, and so therefore our answer is going to be B. If you increase wind speed, you increase transpiration. That's wrong. If you increase surface area, you increase transpiration. And if you increase temperature, you also increase transpiration. Okay, next one. Which row in the table describes the features of phloem? Now, we know that phloem transports sugar, so it's going to be one of these 2. Okay, it won't be C or D because it doesn't transport water. That's the xylem. And we know it has sieve plates, so it's going to be that one there. Okay, good stuff. Now, what we're going to do is we're just going to skip ahead because this question here is one that I want us to have a closer look at. It says, the diagram below shows 3 parts of a plant. Describe the structures and processes involved as water moves through the plant from the soil to the air. Now, this is a 3-mark question, so it's well worth us making sure that we write down as much as we can for this. Okay, not just writing down what happens in transpiration, but also processes involved. So we know that water is absorbed by the root hairs. That happens at the bottom of the plant. But that on its own wouldn't be enough to get us the mark, because the question asks us both the structure and the process. So the name of the process is osmosis. Okay, that's our first mark. Second mark, the water is then transported up the stem via the xylem. Okay. Then diffuses in the spongy mesophyll. And finally, it leaves through the stomata. Now we need a process, which is evaporation. Okay. So that's what you're looking to write for that question. If you write that, you're going to get the full marks for this one. And you'll notice as well, we use our processes there, okay? So osmosis, diffusion, evaporation, okay? So we talk about all those processes as well as the structures. So that's the root hairs, the xylem, the spongy mesophyll, and the stomata. So we're mentioning the structures and the processes there, and that's how we get full marks in a question like that. Okay, so let's have a look at some more questions. Let's have a look at this one here. This is quite a good one based on what we just learned about. So we've to name tissue W from this cross section of a leaf. Okay, now tissue W, if we have a look, it's got cells which are nice and long, and they appear to have several chloroplasts in them. And if you can remember from earlier on, that is the palisade mesophyll. Okay, palisades were wooden walls, these tall spikes that they built around settlements. And also a palace has tall towers. Okay, so that's a couple of ways to remember that that's the palisade mesophyll. And the other way to remember it, of course, is that it has more chloroplasts than all of the other cells around it. Okay. The cells in tissue W have a greater number of chloroplasts than the other leaf cells, as we've just mentioned, suggest the advantage of these cells being located near the upper surface of the leaf. So what's the advantage of having the palisade mesophyll near the upper surface of the leaf? What will they get more of? They are going to get more sunlight that passes through the upper epidermis. And why is that an advantage? Which means more photosynthesis can take place. Okay. So more sunlight means more photosynthesis. That's what we're looking for there for that particular question. And lastly, the leaf vein consists of xylem and phloem tissues, and we have to put down either one, whichever one we feel more confident about, and describe one structural feature of that. So let's just do both, just in case you want to do both. Okay, so we'll put down phloem and xylem. So a structural feature of the xylem is it has lignin, okay, or it's lignified to withstand pressure changes. Okay. For the phloem, it has sieve plates and companion cells. Okay. So we've to describe one structural feature. We've got the lignin with the xylem, and we've got the sieve plates and the companion cells with the phloem. Okay. That's what they're looking for there. Okay, folks. So I hope that was useful. I hope we've understood that topic a little bit better on the basis of that, and that we feel a bit more confident about transporting plants. It's a nice wee topic. I think if you just spend a bit of time and learn it well, there's not a huge amount of different things they can ask about in this topic. So if you know it well, it's going to be a good source of marks for you in the exam. Okay. So anyway, I hope that was useful for you. As always, leave some comments to let me know, and I'll see you all in the next one. Class dismissed.